2. The Sabbath and Life. The death penalties attached to the violation of the Sabbath in the Old Testament era convey two very obvious assumptions. First, the Sabbath law involves a principle so important and basic that violation thereof is a capital offense. Second, the law conveys also the fact that violation of the Sabbath laws involves a kind of death in and of itself, that is, that violation brings on death. The prophets clearly made this assumption. Obedience, by implication, means life. Our familiarity with a matter sometimes makes for ignorance in that we fail to examine it. We are accustomed also to fitting facts into a framework familiar to us. Thus, generations of teachers have cited as an example of humility the statement to a Roman general in a triumphal march, "Remember that you are a man." But the reality was quite different. Quote, "The triumphator was something rather different even from the highest official of the state. In the triumph, the Roman general was endowed with the highest insignia that ancient Rome possessed, the attributes of the chief god of the state, Jupiter. It is true that the slave who held the golden wreath over the triumphant general's head as he drove along in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses had to repeat to him, 'Remember that you are a man.' But that only meant that in the moment of his triumph, the general was regarded as equivalent to the chief god of the state." End quote. To us, these words mean, "Remember, you are human, mortal." To the Romans, they meant, "Remember, you are a god." Thus, to understand anything, it is important to know the context. Jesus said, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." Mark 2:27-28. The Sabbath was made for the true and perfect man, Jesus Christ, who is therefore Lord of the Sabbath. It was therefore also made for the redeemed of Christ, for covenant man, and as a principle of life and regeneration to him. To understand the meaning of this, it is perhaps necessary to do 2 things. First, to remember that the principal purpose of the Sabbath is not worship, but rest. Only as worship qualifies as rest and refreshing to the man, as true worship does, is it a necessary aspect of the Sabbath rest. But the essence of the Sabbath is rest. Second, we view the Sabbath in terms of man exclusively, rather than man centrally, and as a result we miss its meaning. By approaching the Sabbath from the standpoint of the earth, we can better understand its meaning. The commandment makes it clear that the Sabbath day of rest is for man and beast alike. But the details of the law spell out the fact that a sabbatical year is required for the land itself. The comments on this sabbatical year are of interest. Thus, according to Gaylor, quote, "The custom of letting the land lie fallow is common throughout the East, made necessary no doubt by the lack of fertilizers and knowledge of proper methods of rotating crops." End quote. There is no evidence that they lacked in ancient times a knowledge of either fertilizers or crop rotation. Such knowledge is ancient, although men have disregarded their knowledge of it in many eras. Rylersdam holds that, quote, "The original function of the custom is probably religious, to appease the spiritual powers controlling the land or to give them opportunity to restore its fertility." End quote. Such quote-unquote interpretations are not exegesis at all, but indications of a lordly sense of superiority over our forebears, who were lower on the evolutionary ladder of history. The law reads, "And 6 years thou shalt sow thy land, and shalt gather in the fruits thereof. But the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still, that the poor of thy people may eat. And what they leave, the beasts of the field shall eat. In like manner thou shalt deal with thy vineyard and with thy oliveyard." Exodus 23:10-11. "And the Lord spake unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow thy field, and 6 years thou shalt prune thy vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the 7th year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune the vineyard. That which groweth of its own accord of thy harvest thou shalt not reap, neither gather the grapes of thy vine undressed, for it is a year of rest unto the land. And the Sabbath of the land shall be meat for you, for thee and for thy servant, and for thy maid and for thy hired servant, and for thy stranger that sojourneth with thee, and for thy cattle, and for the beast that are in thy land, shall all the increase thereof be meat. Leviticus 25, 1-7. And if ye shall say, What shall we eat the 7th year? Behold, we shall not sow nor gather in our increase. Then I will command my blessing upon you in the 6th year, and it shall bring forth fruit for 3 years. And ye shall sow the 8th year, and eat yet of old fruit unto the 9th year. Until her fruits come in, ye shall eat of the old store. Leviticus 25, 20-22. These laws, it should be noted, were not too well observed in much of Israel's history. Between the Exodus and the Babylonian captivity, it was neglected 70 times, and hence 70 years of captivity were imposed to give the land rest. 2 Chronicles 36:21. This means that more than half the time the law was not observed. After the captivity, this law was observed, but others broken, and Tacitus, History, Volume 4, commented on it. Julius Caesar remitted Jewish taxes in the 7th year in recognition of their custom. Josephus, Antiquitates Judaicae, Volume 14, 10, 6. However, according to Oler, the Jubilee was not observed, only the sabbatical years. There was to be no pruning or planting in the Sabbath year, nor any attempt to kill the insects, or otherwise interfere with natural processes in the field. The fruit had to remain in the field, except for what passers-by, servants, or owners plucked to eat. No real harvesting was permitted, only eating. This prohibition of any real harvesting or storing of produce in the sabbatical year is clearly stated in Leviticus 25:20. But the law has still more to say about the Sabbath of the land, the Jubilee year. Every 50th year was a Jubilee year, inaugurated by blowing the trumpet on the Day of Atonement. Since the 49th year was a Sabbath year, the Jubilee marked 2 Sabbath years in a row. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the Day of Atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. It shall be a Jubilee unto you, and ye shall return every man unto his possession, and ye shall return every man unto his family. A Jubilee shall that 50th year be unto you. Ye shall not sow, neither reap that which groweth of itself in it, nor gather the grapes in it of thy vine undressed. For it is the Jubilee. It shall be holy unto you. Ye shall eat the increase thereof out of the field. Leviticus 25, 8-12. Miklam regarded it as quote-unquote very curious that the Jubilee, which he is not sure existed, began on the Day of Atonement. The answer appears in the laws which immediately follow. In the year of this Jubilee ye shall return every man unto his possession. And if thou sell aught unto thy neighbor, or buyest aught of thy neighbor's hand, ye shall not oppress one another. According to the number of years after the Jubilee thou shalt buy of thy neighbor, and according unto the number of years of the fruits he shall sell unto thee. According to the multitude of years thou shalt increase the price thereof, and according to the fewness of years thou shalt diminish the price of it. For according to the number of the years of the fruits doth he sell unto thee. Ye shall not therefore oppress one another, but thou shalt fear thy God, for I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 25, 13-17. To analyze this legislation, it is apparent first that the purpose is not, as many hold, quote-unquote humanitarian. Certainly the poor of thy people ate of the field in the Sabbath year, but they could glean the fields every year, so that no special sabbatical year was necessary to provide for the poor. To attempt to justify the Sabbath day or year for reasons other than the Sabbath itself is to deny that this is a separate commandment, embodying in and of itself a particular aspect of God's righteousness and law. The purpose of the Sabbath is the Sabbath, that is, the rest and release of redemption and regeneration. Second, in the supreme expression in the Mosaic legislation of the Sabbath principle, the Jubilee year, the Jubilee is begun by the sounding of the trumpet or ram's horn on the Day of Atonement. Miklam found this strange, but Ginsburg stated its meaning very clearly in his comment on Leviticus 25:9. Quote, On the close of the great Day of Atonement, when the Hebrews realized that they had peace of mind, that their Heavenly Father had annulled their sins, and that they had become reunited to Him through His forgiving mercy, every Israelite was called upon to proclaim throughout the land, by 9 blasts of the cornet, that he too had given the soil rest, that he had freed every encumbered family estate, and that he had given liberty to every slave who was now to rejoin his kindred. Inasmuch as God has forgiven his debts, he also is to forgive his debtors." End quote. The Sabbath recalled the creation Sabbath. The institution of the Israelite Sabbath recalled Israel's redemption and regeneration. The goal of the Sabbath, as Hebrews 3 makes clear, is the promised land, the new creation, in Jesus Christ. The Sabbath therefore sets forth the restoration and restitution of all things in Christ. In the Jubilee year, as in each sabbatical year, debts ran out. The modern statute of limitations on the collection of debts is an adaptation of this biblical law. In the Jubilee year also, the rural landholdings reverted to their original owners. Slaves were freed, as on each sabbatical year. The Jubilee marked a 2-year holiday in which covenant man celebrated the foretaste of the great Sabbath of the new creation. Because the Jubilee began on the evening of the Day of Atonement, it made clear the foundation of the new creation, atonement through the blood of the Lamb of the covenant. Creation and recreation were thus basic to the Sabbath. Man rests in God's finished work of redemption proclaimed before the time. By faith, man, anticipating the final victory and rejoicing in the present deliverance, lives by faith in the sufficiency of God. Third, the great work of restoration, of undoing the work of the fall, includes the soil also. By this rest, the soil also is restored and revitalized. By allowing the field to go to weeds, the weeds of the field are given the opportunity to bring to the topsoil minerals from below and to revitalize the soil. The vines and trees are given free growth, unpruned, and again renew their vitality. The fruit which falls and rots again contributes to the soil. The value of the Sabbath in regenerating the soil is very great. But man, lacking faith, prefers his own work to God's work, and his proposed rest to God's Sabbath. God's method is called crude, and modern sprays, manufactured fertilizers, and other devices are used, and the soil is steadily mined and abused. The soil is treated as something science can make and remake, and even do without. Very few scientists treat the soil with any respect. Notable exceptions are Sir Albert Howard, An Agricultural Testament, Friend Sykes, Modern Humus Farming, William A. Albrecht, Soil Fertility and Animal Health, and Joseph A. Konenauer, Weeds, Guardians of the Soil, and Water and the Cycle of Life. These and other writers make clear the extensive abuse of the soil, the function of microorganisms in the soil, the value of compost and of trees in regenerating the soil, and much more. The value of wild animals and birds in the life cycles of the earth has scarcely been touched. The earth clearly is renewed by rest, or it is exploited ruthlessly and finally turned into a desert. Many once populous areas are today desert, as witness Babylon and the Sahara. When God ordained that Israel and Judah go into captivity, it was not only to punish the people, but to restore the land. We are plainly told that Judah went into captivity to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. 2 Chronicles 36:21. The prophecy of Jeremiah referred to is Jeremiah 25:9-12. It is recalled in Daniel 9:2. The captivity was in fulfillment of the prophecy of the law concerning violations of the Sabbaths. Then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate, and ye be in your enemy's land. Even then shall the land rest, and enjoy her Sabbath. Leviticus 26:34. The land also shall be left of them, and shall enjoy her Sabbaths, while she lieth desolate without them, and they shall accept of the punishment of their iniquity, because even they despised my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. Leviticus 26:43. This 70-year-long Sabbath was God's mercy on the land and on Israel. After the crucifixion of Christ, no such mercy was extended to the land, and its history has been one of the steady erosion of soil and men. The land and the people show the effects of the curse. Although Israel between the captivity and the crucifixion observed the Sabbaths of the earth, at other points they despised God, and they crucified His Son, so that the curse fell upon them and upon the earth for their sake. Clearly, the renewal of the earth is a basic aspect of the Sabbath. The renewal of all things is basic to the Sabbath, and the earth is central to this renewal. Men can ignore the Sabbath requirements of the earth only at the peril of judgment and death. Clearly, the death penalty is operative in history, and nations which mine the earth and use its resources abusively are doomed to die. The logical assumption then is this: if contempt of the Sabbath is so serious with respect to the earth, is it not equally serious with respect to man and beast? We do know that modern poultry methods with the round-the-clock lighting of the cages, chemically quote-unquote fortified foods to set up growth, and various methods used to increase egg-laying, result in hens which are no longer profitable for retention after they begin molting. Dairy cows similarly have a limited lifespan now. Not surprisingly, the produce from such animals no longer has the nutritional value it once did. With regard to men, continued stress leads to death, we are told. Men's inability to rest, his lack of a true Sabbath, his lack of faith, lead to a stress-filled life which ends in death. The study of stress from a non-Christian perspective has been extensively made in recent years by Dr. Selye. Man needs rest. He requires the Sabbath truly to live. But without faith he cannot have true rest, nor can he give rest to others, to the soil, or to the animal creation. Very often, pagan societies on a limited scale have practiced excellent soil policies from a pragmatic perspective. But the practice, being purely pragmatic, has not been joined with a similarly wise policy with respect to animals. More often than not, pagan cultures have been prevented from large-scale destruction only by their small-scale abilities. When man destroys the soil, pollutes food, and poisons the air and the water, he does pass a death sentence against himself. The extent of the pollution is very great, and it is aggravated by man's confidence that quote-unquote science can somehow cope with it by some new artificial device. The essence of the Sabbath is the work of restoration, God's new creation. The goal of the Sabbath is the second creation rest of God. Man is required to rest and to allow earth and animals to rest, that God's restoration may work, and creation be revitalized. Every Sabbath rest points to the new creation, the regeneration and restoration of all things. God's work of restoration is from the ground up, and His Sabbath must therefore apply to the soil also. But fourth, the Sabbath cannot be reduced to soil conservation any more than it can be reduced to humanitarianism. It is a Sabbath unto the Lord. It is a covenant sign according to God's own declaration. Wherefore I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt, and brought them into the wilderness. And I gave them my statutes, and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They walked not in my statutes, and they despised my judgments, which if a man do, he shall even live in them. And my Sabbaths they greatly polluted. Then I said I would pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness, to consume them. Ezekiel 20:10-13. The Sabbath derives its essential meaning thus from the fact that it witnesses to an essential and life-giving covenant between God and man. The source of that life is God, not the law or the Sabbath in and of itself. Israel after the captivity kept the Sabbath rigidly, applying it to man, earth, and animals, but the form gave no life. They denied the Sabbath by trusting in their works and their blood, their descent from Abraham, and they died in their blindness. Observance of the Sabbath did not save them who denied and crucified the Lord of the Sabbath. Churchmen who limit the meaning of the Sabbath, or who feel it is obeyed in worship and inactivity, have no knowledge of its meaning. Certain Pharisees debated over the inadvisability of eating eggs, because the hen may have labored over them on the Sabbath. But they did not trust in God for their salvation. Their emphasis on quote-unquote no work was in itself a work of man, a proud boast in their ability to fulfill a law, and this same Pharisaism is apparent in some churches today. The Sabbath is life to the man who looks to the Lord for life, and allows God to work throughout all creation as the great re-creator. It is more than an outward observance, and it cannot be joined with any humanistic confidence in man's works, or the state's works, as man's source of rest and salvation. Fifth, forgiveness is a basic aspect of the Sabbath. The grace of God unto the remission of sins is the covenant of man's Sabbath. It means rest, release from the burden of sin and guilt. The Lord's Prayer, which looks forward to the great Sabbath, Thy kingdom come, has as a central petition the Jubilee release, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors, Matthew 6:12. Lenski translated this, and dismiss for us our debts, as we too did dismiss our debtors. The translation quote-unquote trespasses is good, in that it points more clearly to our sins. But the word debts has a broader connotation often, as it definitely does here. As Lenski observed, quote, so great are our debts to God that we can never hope to pay them, and our only help is that God will remit them gratis, by way of gift, for Christ's sake. End quote. The Sabbath means rest, forgiveness, the cancellation of debt and weariness. It means fresh life. Since the unbeliever is by nature a slave, he is not released from debts. At the end of every 7 years there must be a canceling of debts, and this shall be the way of canceling. Every creditor shall cancel the loan he made to his neighbor or to his brother. He shall make no demand for repayment, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. A foreigner you may press for payment, but whatever of yours was due from a brother you shall cancel. However, there should be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will abundantly bless you in the land he will give you to possess as an heritage, if you listen to the Lord your God and rightly observe all these commandments which today I am enjoining upon you. When the Lord your God blesses you as he promised you, then you shall lend to many nations, but not borrow. You shall rule many nations, but they shall not rule over you. Deuteronomy 15, 1-6, Berkeley Version. God's goal is a debt-free society which is also poverty-free, and this is only possible in terms of his law. The effect of the Sabbath law here is marked in Christendom. As Clark noted, quote, modern statutes of limitation and bankruptcy acts fulfill the purpose of the ancient law of sabbatical release. The former by forbidding the bringing of an action upon a debt after a certain number of years, and the latter enabling a debtor to turn over his property in satisfaction of his debts. End quote. The modern statutes are thoroughly secular and profane in intention, however, and while derived from the biblical Sabbath law of release, are alien in spirit from it. The Sabbath release confers life, but to those alien to God, neither the Sabbath nor its release can have their true meaning.